So as we know, Secretary of State John Kerry is trying to figure out just what the future is going to be of the Iranian nuclear program. He is negotiating. He is currently on a trip. He departed Jordan this morning on his way to a Tel Aviv meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, and he's going to talks in Geneva. You can see Secretary of State Kerry here. Here's the problem. There's no deal yet. In fact, they haven't really put forth even what the deal necessarily would be. There are some outlines already that have been given. But people are already very concerned, and by people, first and foremost, I mean Benjamin Netanyahu himself. Listen to this.
The deal that is being discussed in Geneva right now is a bad deal. It's a very bad deal. Iran is not required to take apart even one centrifuge. But the international community is relieving sanctions on Iran. For the first time after many years, Iran gets everything that it wanted at this stage, and it pays nothing.
Netanyahu obviously very concerned. Now, the deal has not been finalized. Everyone agrees on that, but there are some early indications of what it would be. In fact, we can show you, based upon sources that CNN is citing, that this would the deal would mean that Iran stops enriching uranium at 20% purity, not a complete stop on uranium enrichment, renders unusable most of its nuclear fuel stockpile. It won't use advanced IR-2 centrifuges, and it won't activate the plutonium reactor at Arak. Now, I want to bring in our guest to help us work through some of exactly what's happening here. We have Dovid Efune. He's the editor of Algemeiner newspaper. Dovid, thanks for joining us once again. Good to have you here.
Absolute pleasure, always.
So my colleagues here, in my absence yesterday, discussed a bit of what's happening in Iran and vis-a-vis its neighbors. I want to ask you about the Israeli side of the equation. It seems like Netanyahu is drawing a line in the sand. He's very clear. He doesn't care what Kerry comes up with. It doesn't matter what the framework is. Unless they stop enriching uranium, everything else is moot, and Israel leaves all options on the table.
Well, I tell you what, it actually really goes even further, because what really bothers the Israelis is that they don't want to leave Iran with the capacity to enrich uranium when at some point they might decide to do so. So, you know, especially since the regime has a history of not being honest. So, you know, this is like telling a crack addict that I'm going to make you a nice lunch if you stop using, and then handing him back a bag of needles.
I know, I have to say, you know, Netanyahu seemed to be pretty bellicose. I've said before here that I think that if they don't find a means, if no one strikes the reactors, that it's just going to be a matter of time before Iran actually has a nuclear capability, whether it weaponizes it right away or, as you point out, how close it gets. It's essentially no longer something that can be stopped without a strike. Netanyahu seemed to be making a pretty clear statement himself about that. Listen to this.
Israel is not obliged by this agreement, and Israel will do everything it needs to do to defend itself and to defend the security of its people.
Dovid, do you think that the situation is such that if Israel feels like this bad deal that is not finalized, but this deal that's being talked about is finalized, if both sides come to this agreement, will they not abide necessarily by it themselves? Are they willing to use the military option in order to prevent Iran from going nuclear, which would obviously be a slap in the face to the U.S. and the rest of the international community? But as Netanyahu says, they're self-defense. They don't care what else is at stake here.
Well, that's exactly the thing. I mean, a big part of what you can see in Netanyahu's obvious frustration is that these talks really tie Israel's hands in that way as well, because it turns Israel into the party spoiler, whatever takes place. But, you know, this is something that the Jewish people has had to contend with and has understood from history, and that's something that he's very conscious of, that sometimes no one is going to come to your defense, and when push comes to shove, you have to do something. And he sees that absolutely as his foremost responsibility.
And isn't this a new posture, though, for Israeli-U.S. relations? I mean, he hasn't really had to face Netanyahu, or Israel per se, hasn't really had to face the prospect of the United States not having their back 100% in something like this. I can't imagine what the mood must be in Israel, looking at the United States, looking at this administration and going, are you guys freaking kidding me with this?
Well, I'll tell you what, to be honest, you know, in international diplomacy, there are always multiple channels. You know, there's what we see and there's what we don't see.
Right.
What we see, yes, there are always smiles and platitudes, etc. But if you look at the history of U.S.-Israeli relationships, there are a number of instances where Israel has literally had to say, I'm sorry, but we have to protect our citizens. And it's a great example. I don't know if you've read George W. Bush in Talking Points. There was a Syrian reactor which then at the time, in 2006, right. it was Prime Minister Olmert called up George Bush and he said, what are we going to do about this? And he said, let's bring it to the UN And Ahmed said, I'm really disappointed with your position, and he went ahead and struck it.
I want to bring my colleagues in, but it's very important to look at the counter-proliferation efforts in the Middle East recently, as you cite. The Israelis have saved us not once, but twice from really bad regimes, Saddam Hussein in 1981 and Assad in 2006. They just did this. They just flew strikes. That's how this stuff gets stopped. So I don't know why we think diplomacy is going to do it. I'm sorry.
Okay, so then let's paint out Dovid Efune's ideal scenario. We did this last night with James Carafano and said, this is a bad deal. Clearly in your mind, this is a bad deal. Give us an ideal scenario. Is it that there are no such thing as good deals and only action is worthy at this point?
Absolutely not. What is necessary is to pursue the course that historically has proven to be effective when it comes to Iran, and that is keep moving the pressure up. The sanctions law that is currently sitting in front of Congress has to be passed. Keep pushing the sanctions further and further and further until Iran comes and says, we're going to stop on our own.
But if that's the case, then there is really no deal, and then that means that Netanyahu has to say what he's saying.
This isn't a deal, though.
Well, but the point is that there's domestic politics at work here in Israel. Netanyahu has to come out and say if that's the situation, if it's always put the pressure up, then any deal that's put on the table, any exchange of any kind, he's going to wind up saying this is bad.
But
Any deal
in
short
this
of them
particular
stopping
deal,
completely.
sure, but this particular deal, if you look at it, a deal has to have a trade. At the end of the day, for what they're proposing right now, Iran can still enrich uranium. They can still they can still build their plutonium retractor. So what is the trade that they're giving up here at all? We are essentially giving Iran a gift here of saying, here, we're going to ease your sanctions and maybe you'll reduce 20% of your uranium enrichment.
The P5+1 is talking about a few things, and I think we could say this is nibbling around the edges. They would unfreeze some Iranian assets and banks held overseas. They would consider easing some sanctions, banning trade in gold, precious metals, petrochemicals, and there are some other sort of little sweeteners.
But what is Iran giving up?
But
What are they trading
what I mean.
with?
You see, this is exactly the point I make. This is a belligerent regime. This is a regime whose media the other day published a simulated strike on Israeli population centers.
Absolutely.
There's no back and forth here. This is
They
not
killed Americans in
business
Iraq.
deal,
We
right?
don't even talk about this.
You guys have to stop what you're doing, or else.
I think the idea that Iran is getting everything that it wants here and that they are giving up nothing is definitely belligerence in and of itself in terms of the language that's being used here. It's not like every sanction is being lifted in this potential deal.
But they're still getting something and giving up little.
No, and they are also, and whether or not these are, I mean, we can
But
debate
uranium
whether or not they're good
enrichment
ideas.
is
They
a
are giving up some
zero-sum
things. You could put back up that list. There were 4 different things.
Yeah,
there.
But that is a
uranium
dramatically
enrichment is the key to
imbalanced
all of
thing.
this,
It's
and
not
uranium-
acknowledged that as false.
They won't give up on uranium enrichment. That's the one key thing.
But David, one last question. And if the only deal that works is you must give up, you must stop enriching them. We also said in the same segment, we don't trust them. So how?
Well, again, this is a very, very crucial point. There's a difference between stopping uranium enrichment and removing the capacity to enrich uranium. This is what Israel wants, that Iran no longer has the ability to do it ever. And if you have a look at what the Americans are asking for in the deal that was just up on the screen, it says stop doing this, stop doing that, stop doing this, stop using heroin. You know, you can say stop from today to tomorrow, but, you know, they have a history here where they've been pursuing it.
People who were involved in the Iraq war intelligence, going up to that, have to say that the biological chemical weapons factories, it wasn't just did they have them, it was how quickly could they reconstitute them, and that was part of the decision to go in.
100%, because you're not going to be there forever. You know, you've got to make sure that it can't happen.
This is not going to end well. But Dovid, thank you very much for joining us, man. We appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Always a pleasure.
President Obama may finally be getting around to one of his biggest broken campaign pledges, and that's closing the prison at Guantanamo Bay. We've got some details for you in Q&A tonight.